Hello there guys. In this video I'm going to be making this autumn scenery featuring the Rutscher tank from Das Werk. This tiny tank is very much a paper panzer. Depending on the sources you read, it was originally envisaged in 1942 before being shelved, and then the concept was brought back to life again around 1944 as the E5 tank. And again, depending on the source, either none were built or two prototypes were built. This is the wooden mock-up of the tank. As you can see, it is a tiny vehicle with a crew of just two, and it's made by Das Werk in conjunction with Amusing Hobby. Our instructions are fairly straightforward. We build up the lower hull and attach the running gear, some Lincoln length tracks, a few details on the upper hull, that then goes onto the lower hull, and we are more or less done. We have three very different paint markings on the back, all of which are based on real schemes, although of course the tank itself is fictional. Recently I was looking back at some of my older videos, and in those I did a lot more build sequences where I simply got on with the process without yapping the whole time. So given the simplicity of this kit, I am going to build it without commentary. With the base vehicle built, I did try a couple of options to add a bit more detail. Initially I built this small rack for some fuel jerry cans on the side, but then I wasn't really liking the look of it. I felt the tank was so small that this kind of broke up the lines of it a bit too much. So I abandoned that idea. But I did add a couple of tools onto those fenders. We don't get any with the kit, these are just straight out of the spare parts box. Then I gave the entire model a prime in black. Why did I use gloss black? That's easy. I put the wrong primer in the airbrush. I meant to put the matte black in. I did think it was going down with quite a wet look when I put it down, and that's why, because it's gloss. It shouldn't affect the overall look though. For this model I wanted to use the so-called ambush camo scheme. This was a short-lived scheme used from around August 1944 to October 1944. And it's quite a complex scheme designed to replicate the dappled light and shade of a forest environment. The ambush scheme itself has two sub-classifications. One is the so-called dot scheme, as you can see here, where we've got the base Dunkelgelb, we've got the olive green and the red-brown on top. And then on top of those two disruptive colours we've got small dots, or almost like chips, of the Dunkelgelb, designed to break them up. This dot scheme was applied by vehicles coming out of Daimler-Benz factories. I've built a couple of vehicles in this scheme before. First of all, my Sturmtiger, and secondly my Panther, which still isn't finished. The alternative to the dot scheme is the so-called disc pattern, which was used by MAN and MNH factories. The overall effect is very similar, except that here you can see we've got disc-shaped patterns of those two disruptive colours over the Dunkelgelb. And it's almost the interaction between those discs that creates the Dunkelgelb sort of a disruptive chips. I've never tried the disc scheme before, so that's what I'm going for here. I figured the easiest way to implement this would be to apply my Dunkelgelb base coat, which was the AK Real Colours Dunkelgelb, and then just apply general patterns of the olive green and the red brown over the top. Again, both from AK Real Colours. This was done freehand with the airbrush, no masking required. The scheme on the instructions is pretty intensive. I'm going to do a smaller number of dots than that, and the way that I did that was by using a mask, created using my Cricut machine. So in the Cricut Design Space software, I created a circle, scaled it to 3mm diameter, and then copied and pasted it loads of times into the canvas. Then I simply grouped some of the circles together into rough clumps. I decided to do multiple individual clumps rather than one big pattern, because I can always pull these off separately and combine them to make bigger patterns. This is the result after the cutting. Hopefully you can see them in the light. And then I could just peel them off and apply them to the vehicle surface. The idea here is that any area not covered by the mask will be covered by another coat of Dunkelgelb, leaving behind the coloured dots. And I quickly learnt that my first round of cutting was not enough, so I just cut the exact same sheet again, relying on the fact that I could rotate or even cut up the shapes to keep some variation. As I say, I then applied an overall coat of Dunkelgelb, and when it was dry I could remove the masks. And I think that's worked quite well. The effect is quite nice there. With hindsight, I think I probably need a larger ratio of green and red-brown to the Dunkelgelb, but I think I'm happy with that for my first attempt. Some photos that you see online do appear to have dots rather than discs of the two camouflage colours interspersed all over the vehicle, but I decided not to do that. I didn't like really the look of the reference photos that I saw there. And of course, this is a paper Panzer, so I'm not necessarily trying to be 100% historically accurate, because I can't be. The good old Galeri metallic markers came out for painting the tools. They're really convenient for things like this where you don't have to get out the paint, pour a bit out, clean your brush afterwards, end up wasting some paint typically as well. Although since I only have the metallic colours, I did have to use Vallejo model colour for the other items. We do get a small decal sheet with the model. Of course most of us have spare decals in the stash by now as well, but I just chose some from this sheet that I thought looked quite nice. Some fairly low visibility German crosses, and the number 3 because why not? Then it was a case of painting the rubber on the road wheels and giving everything a coat of VMS matte varnish. While the varnish was drying, I turned my attention to the base, and I wanted a fairly simple base for this one. I've had this Model Scene grass mat for a while. You can see I've used it a couple of times. I bought this in a model shop in Singapore, and the last time I was in Singapore was 2019, so I have had it a while. It's probably about time I use it up. I've run out of pieces of slate which I've been using for bases recently, so it's back to the good old XPS foam, which I cut into an irregular shape and then placed the grass mat on top. I wanted to use this spare trim that I had laying around, but it was a bit too shallow. You can see there the ugly exposed edge of the grass mat. So I put that 10mm XPS foam to the side and used some 6mm foam. And now the side fits better. These model scene bases really are quite nice. They do a huge variety of them, and I do like the fact that they have a lot of variation within the individual piece. There's no sort of repeating patterns or anything here. So I'm not really going to add much to this in terms of extra foliage or anything like that. However, because it is quite springy, I do need to avoid just placing the tank on top, because it will look very much like it's floating. And even a tank like this, I think it was designed originally or intended to weigh about 5 tons, and they couldn't get the design weight down that low. So it's definitely going to be sinking into this potentially quite soft autumn ground. The easiest way to do that is basically to rip up some of the base, preferably in a track shape and where the tracks will go. And I keep all of that material that I've scraped away because it will be useful later when we come to weathering the tracks for bits of grass getting caught up in it and so on. I did refer to my mega tub of tufts and choose a couple of appropriate looking tufts just to slightly break up that pattern there, but I mean ever so few here really. I know a lot of people paint things like static grass, and I often do myself, but in this case I feel like the scenery mat is already quite matte. It doesn't have that kind of plastic shine to it, and therefore I think it's fine for what we're doing. Plus I think if we tried to paint it, it would be very, very hard due to the density of the grass effects. And of course we'd lose all the colour in those flowers or fallen leaves. I did want this tank to be in a kind of forest environment with some small trees around it, so I've got loads of seafoam left over from many projects. As you can see, this has already been painted brown sometime in the past. My original plan was to take some of these dead autumn leaves, which I got from a model show recently, but when I cracked them open I realised I made a bit of a silly mistake, in that these might be perfect for dead leaf scatter on the ground, but they're not really leaf shape, and therefore making them hang off the end of a tree doesn't look very good. That's not a criticism of the product, that is a criticism of my ability to choose the right tool for the job. And I think if I make another diorama with lots and lots of leaf litter on the ground, these will be perfect for that. So instead I turned to this yellow flocking, the label for which has long since disappeared. I did think this would be way too fine, but I thought I'd give it a try anyway. And it turns out it's not too bad. If you dip the seafoam in some watered down PVA glue and then sprinkle the flocking over the top, of course it never falls in individual pieces, it tends to clump a little bit, and therefore does give the effect of some autumn leaves. I have some similar scale red flocking which I use very sparingly over the top of that. My original plan had been to paint these, but once they were finished I was fairly happy with them the way they are. Okay, they're more impressionistic than artistic, but you know, that's okay. And because I don't like to make things too easy for myself, I decided to go back and paint the trunks of the trees white, rather than doing it before I added the flocking. And they're just attached to the base using a small amount of superglue. No figures come with the kit, but I wanted a couple in this small scene. I grabbed a tank commander from the spares drawer. I don't remember which kit he came with, and then I grabbed this machine gunner figure from this Tamiya German field briefing set. I wanted a camouflage pattern on our machine gunner. There were several similar patterns used by Germany during World War II. One of them is the so-called P-dot pattern, but the one I'm doing here is based on the oak leaf A pattern. I can't show you the reference image I used for copyright reasons, but here's a similar one. And of course these autumn colours go perfectly with my scene. This figure was base coated in Vallejo chocolate brown, and then I used this cork brown colour, which as it turned out was a bit too light to do the initial pattern on the camouflage. I was trying to keep the edges of these blotches quite broken up rather than being smooth shapes, trying to take into account the folds in the fabric and also where the fabric might join. So for example, if the sleeve was made of a separate piece of fabric from the main body, we'd expect the camouflage pattern not to run over the sleeve onto the chest. My second colour was this German camo black brown. Here I applied separate blotches of that, noting that on the reference image sometimes these patches touched the existing patches and sometimes they existed on their own freestanding. And I'm making these patches big enough that the final colour can go inside them. For the final colour I took this Vallejo orange colour and applied it inside the existing patches. On the reference images I showed, the orange was never touching the base layer, it was always inside another colour. Sometimes those were bigger patches, sometimes they were just small dots, sometimes there'd be several pieces of orange inside one larger alternative colour. And by building that up slowly, I think I've achieved something that I'm moderately happy with. However, once the paint had dried and I looked back at the reference image, I realised there were a lot more small dots on the reference image compared to my model, and far fewer areas of large unbroken base colour. So I went back and I just filled in some of those dots with the black brown and then with the orange inside some of those. And while I'm sure I've seen far better oak leaf patterns painted, I was pretty happy with this one. For these figures I tried these AK Gen 3 flesh colours, starting with the tanker of unknown origin. He's got a much easier uniform to paint than the other guy, and he simply had a coat of black and then a highlight coat from above of black lightened with flesh. The base coat I'm putting on here is, funnily enough, base flesh, which is quite a dark colour, and then I'm going over the top on key areas with some light flesh. I know a lot of figure painters use 3 colours for the flesh or even more. I've stuck with 2 for this one, but I was quite happy with the way that these paints worked, and so I would be tempted to get maybe one darker and one lighter Gen 3 colour the next time I'm in the model shop. A variety of acrylic colours were used to do the details on the figures, and I know I should be using pink here rather than red. I also went back with a lightened version of the black, so a grey, and tried to do some highlights on the tanker's legs and uniform. Once the paints were dry, I gave the figures a coat of VMS flat varnish, followed by quite a heavy wash with some sepia oil paint. And my figures are often a bit too clean, so I took some of the earth colours that I've used on the tank and really slapped them onto the machine gun figure in particular, ultimately covering most of his legs. Even though this looks quite thick as you put it on, it does become somewhat translucent, so you can still see the camo pattern below. Then it was time to weather the tank. I used the same fairly heavy sepia oil paint pin wash around all of the details on both the wheels and the vehicle itself. As I go through this, you can see just how much that detail stands out, although of course the oil paint does fade once it is dried. Before I could weather the tank, I had to paint the exhaust, which I forgot to do before. I know rusty exhaust is a bit of a controversial thing, but I quite like the look of it. So I took a combination of these crusted rust deposits, which are a bit too bright, and mixed them with this track rust pigment. Basically I put on the enamel first, and then brushed in with an old brush the pigments on top. And that gives it a nice texture, the sort of corroding, heat damage perhaps, paint job. I'm not sure if this tank had rubber track pads or not. I decided they'd be made out of steel, metal, and therefore I gave them a metal dry brush over the raised areas. I then took some dots of buff and grey oil paint and used that as a streaking effect, dragging it down the vehicle to give the effect of sort of accumulated dust and dirt and grime. That also helps sort of tone down that camo scheme. Finally, for the weathering, I decided to take this enamel earth and mix in some European earth pigment. The resulting quite light brown colour I heavily applied all over the vehicle, trying to get into the recesses behind the running gear, the underside of the tank, and so on. With hindsight, it was perhaps a little bit too light, and certainly when I was splattering it here on the wheels, it was a little bit too thick as well, so I didn't get the fine misty spray that I would prefer. Nevertheless, the great thing about enamels is that they take a while to dry, and so I was able to go and work that with some odourless thinner, and also to take some wet mud and just darken that effect. I was also able to take some of the recovered grass that I took from the grass mat and blend that into the tracks. Finally, the same enamel was used on the base, partially to give the impression of tank tracks, and partially to act as an adhesive to keep the tank on the base. And I simply put the tank down, weighed it down, and that stopped it from rising up above the grass. A few final effects included sprinkling some of the yellow leaf material around the bottom of the trees to simulate fallen leaves, and to use some model leaves on the side of the vehicle itself. And with that, my tiny paper panzer was complete. And there we go guys, that was my autumn scene featuring the Rutscher paper panzer. Do let me know in the comments below what you thought of this build. I really enjoyed it and I thought it came out quite well considering I used that very fine yellow powder for the trees. I was hoping to photograph this in some low evening light to get that kind of orangey glow over it, but I feel like I haven't seen the sun for a week now, so I had to make do with my desktop lights. This was a fun little kit, not super detailed but also not particularly high priced. Although looking at some of the more modern kits that are coming onto the market, like the Tac-On Blitz kits, where you can get a Panther for 20 quid, maybe it doesn't quite fare so well against those. I'll definitely try the disc camo scheme again, and probably with a lot more discs this time. The trick there of course is to get the green and the red-brown area covering most of the tank before you even do the discs. Nevertheless, I think this looks fine and it will go well on my shelf next to my other recent builds. Before I go, I'd like to say thank you very much to all of my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. And of course a huge thank you to you for watching this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And until the next video, thank you again for watching and have fun modelling.